It seemed like someone was pulling those hands away, but at the same time not. He couldn't be sure. The only things he could see were those bloody, scarred faces, those people with missing limbs who looked like they were going to tear him apart and devour him piece by piece. He didn't know how long it had been when in the far distance he heard the demonic howling of a horn. The crowd only cared for their own screaming and tearing and ignored the horn completely. But Julien snapped out of it instantly. That was the sound of Yong'an's victory horn. He couldn't sit still any longer, or perhaps the burden had finally crushed him. His body bent and he keeled over. At the same time, the giant gilded figure he had so arduously supported mimicked his movement, like its life was suddenly snuffed out. It collapsed with a boom. Along with it came another loud rumble. That gigantic, heavy, celestial pagoda came crashing down, crumbling like the golden statue. The gilded figure shouldn't have been so breakable, but because Julien had injected too much spiritual power into it, hoping that it'd hold up the celestial pagoda, it had long since grown fragile. The patients who had escaped Bouillot Forest were fleeing, dying, getting hurt. The crowds scurried wildly through the palace and the streets, some dodging fragments of that celestial pagoda, some dodging those horrifying disease victims. With both hands clutching his own head, Julien ran and stumbled as he headed for the grand gates of the imperial city. The city towers were ablaze, rolling with thick black smoke. Julien rushed up to the terrace, passing numerous distraught, fleeing soldiers, but when he arrived at the platform, he didn't know what to do. He stared down below at a complete loss, his face ashen and streaked with tears that had started to flow without him realizing. In his blurry field of vision, corpses scattered the fields. Only the silhouette of a white-clothed figure was distinct, his expansive sleeves fluttering. That figure wasn't a youth, but a man, and when he turned his head, he spotted Julien from afar. He waved at him in a carefree manner, looking like he was about to vanish into the air. Seeing this, Julien cried sharply, "Don't go!" The first 2 times Julien had encountered him, he'd used a fake skin. This time, Julien's instincts told him that this must be his true form. Thus, he hopped over the city wall without hesitation and leapt from the tall battlement. Julien had jumped from extreme heights countless times, relying on his strong spiritual power and martial might. He landed safely every time, and it always filled him with pleasure and pride. Every time, he was the very picture of the celestial descents they spoke of in legends. This time, however, he was no longer a legend. When he landed, he wasn't steady, and his foot twisted. A needle-sharp pain instantly shot up his leg and through his entire body. He had broken his leg. Breaking a leg wasn't really a big deal, and it soon healed, but since that day, it were as though Julien had become an entirely different person. It was like he had lost his spirits and his divine invincibility. After the first defeat, there would be a second, and then a third. He didn't want to draw his sword, nor join the battlefield anymore, but because there was no one who could shield or replace him, he could only boldly sally forth. On the battlefield, he didn't slack off. He genuinely did his utmost. But for some reason, even though he was clearly a young man barely past 20, the hand holding the sword shook like that of an ailing elder. He shuddered with a heart full of fear, yet he couldn't explain who or what exactly he was afraid of. Finally, the soldiers who used to revere him began to lose patience. Julien knew that a rumor had started circulating among them. How was he a martial god? More like a god of misfortune. He couldn't rebut it, because he had also started wondering the same thing. Had he really, maybe, turned into a god of misfortune? It would have been wonderful if that was the only issue. But the real catastrophe, the thing that had sealed the kingdom of Shinla's doom, was that human face disease was now completely out of control. 500, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. Toward the end, Julien no longer dared ask just how many people had been infected today. And at the end of it all, like a sentence handed down to a criminal, the heavenly realm at last opened its gates to him and sent forth a message. "Your Highness, it is time to return to the upper court." It was clear what would be waiting for him when he returned to the heavens. Fengxian and Muqing both looked a little uneasy for once, while Shilian, on the other hand, was concerned with something else. "Before we leave, I want to go somewhere to have a look," he said to them. "Where?" Fengxian asked. "The Royal Holy Temple," Shilian replied. After a moment of silence, Fengxian said, "Don't." Shilian had already walked off on his own. "Your Highness!" Fengxian cried, but seeing that he couldn't be stopped, he and Muqing could only run after him. The three of them hiked up the mountain on foot. The Royal Holy Temple was where Shilian's first holy temple had been erected, and it was also where his first divine statue was built. However, by the order of the state preceptor, those 3,000 disciples had long since been disbanded and sent down the mountain, and the Royal Holy Temple stood empty. When they were halfway up the mountain, Shilian looked down. He could see clusters of fires ablaze everywhere in the capital, the brilliant flames reflecting a sky full of twinkling stars. A beautiful sight to behold. Fengxian, however, yelled angrily, "Those madmen!" Shilian's eyes were transfixed by the flames, and Fengxian tried again. "Stop looking! There's nothing good to see!" In recent days, Fengxian had yelled at Shilian countless times, "Do you enjoy finding grief for yourself, or what?" But truthfully, Shilian didn't know what he wanted to do. He only knew that whenever another one of his temples was burned down or desecrated, he was uncontrollably drawn to see it for himself. Yet once he'd seen, he couldn't speak nor stop anyone. He could only stand there and watch helplessly. What was there to see? He didn't know either. Firelight was also blazing on the Crown Prince summit. Fengxian was aghast. They couldn't even let the Royal Holy Temple go? Did someone desecrate their ancestors' graves or something? He trailed off and shut up, since he realized the suffering of those from Shinle was far worse than any sarcastic comments about desecrating ancestors' graves. However, the fire wasn't severe, and it soon died down, seemingly extinguished by someone. Now Fengxian was really surprised. These days, there were only people who dared to set fire, not extinguish the flames. If anyone tried to step in, to talk down or stop those angry mobs from setting fires and destroying temples, they would be treated like the very god of misfortune. Shilian himself and got beaten to death. Because of this, the three of them no longer dared to reveal themselves before mortals, and had long since hidden away their forms. All along the path up the mountain, the three could hear the commotion of a brawl. Once they reached the Crown Prince summit, sure enough, the palace of Shinle had already been mostly torn down, leaving only the frame and walls of the Great Hall. That huge divine altar no longer held a divine statue, and there was a gang of riffraff brawling in front of that decrepit hall entrance, jeering as they fought. "You damn mutt! Shitty brat! Did your wife lose her fucking virginity here, or what? Is this broken shrine your precious family jewels or something?" With one look, Shilian knew that this group didn't come to destroy his temple out of anger. They were just a gang of punks who reveled in disorder, and they were either taking advantage of the situation or burning the temple down purely for fun. However, at this point, he didn't really care who was tearing his temples down anymore. Just then, in that crazed brawl, the exceedingly vicious voice of a boy pierced through and echoed in the night sky. "Beat it!" Listening closely, this was actually one person fighting the rest. Moreover, that one person was only a young teenager, still very much a child, but relentless all the same, and he didn't seem to be losing ground. Nevertheless, it was still one against many. The boy's face was already covered in blood and grime, battered blue and purple with cuts all over, to the point that his actual appearance was no longer recognizable. That brat will definitely grow up to be a good man," Fengxian commented. Just then, a malicious glint flashed in one of the men's eyes, and he lifted a giant rock from the ground, ready to bash it into the back of that boy's head. Shilian saw and waved his hand once. The rock in that man's hand instantly rebounded, smashing into his own face, and he screamed as blood spattered out of his nose. The boy was stunned at the sight, but he immediately whirled around and raised his fist for another bout of berserk beating. The way he fought was too frightening, and it scared away that gang of grown men. They pointed at him as they fled, shouting empty threats. "Fuck, just you wait! We've got more guys, we'll get you yet!" The boy sneered, "You dare come back and I'll fucking kill you!" That terrified the men, and they ran off faster. With the fist fight over, the boy rushed over to a small mound and vigorously stomped on a fire that had already been extinguished, killing the last few sparks. After doing so, he entered the great hall. He picked up a piece of paper from the ground, carefully flattened it, and hung it above the altar. Finally, he sat down and leaned against the altar, lost in a daze. Julien walked over and leapt airily onto the altar. He discovered that the paper the boy hung there was a painting. The brushwork was immature, obviously done by someone who had never learned how to paint. Yet every stroke was serious and sincere, depicting the solemn figure of the God-pleasing crown prince. It seemed that this was used to replace the divine statue Julien had summoned away. "Very well painted," Fengshen remarked. After all these trying days, Fengshen had finally found someone who would still defend Julien. He was already so excited that he'd almost joined the fight earlier to help the boy out. So naturally, he felt that anything the boy did was great. Muqing, however, was unspeaking as he lowered his eyes flickering as if he was recalling something. Julien raised his hand and lightly flicked the painting. It wasn't particularly obvious, and could have easily been mistaken for a breeze blowing past. And yet the boy's head shot up from where it lay on his hugged knees, and that heavily injured face brightened instantly at the sight. "Is that you?" he called out. Fengshen was shocked. "What a sharp little brat!" "Let's go," Muqing said. Julien nodded lightly, and he was about to turn around to leave when the boy pounced on the edge of that altar, his breath coming quick. "I know it's you! Your Highness, don't go! I have something to say to you!" Hearing him, the three of them were taken aback. That boy seemed quite nervous, and with his fists clenched, he continued with what he meant to say. "Even though your palaces and temples are burned down, don't be sad. I will build you many more temples in the future. Bigger, more magnificent, better than anyone else's. No one will be able to compete with you. I'll do it." The three were silent. That boy was dirty-faced and shabbily dressed, covered in bruises and cuts, looking extremely sad and pathetic. Yet he spoke such ambitious, bold words. It sounded truly laughable, which brought up complicated feelings. Seeming afraid that his voice might not reach Julien's ears, he cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted toward the painting hung above the altar. "Your Highness, do you hear me? In my heart you are God. You are the only God, the one true God. Do you hear me?" He screamed with all he had, to the point where all of Mount Taikang echoed with his voice. "Do you hear me?" Julien suddenly burst out laughing. That laugh came too abruptly, surprising both Fengshen and Muqing. Julien shook his head as he laughed. The boy obviously couldn't hear him, yet he seemed to have sensed something. His eyes were bright as he looked around. Suddenly, without warning, a drop of ice-cold water landed on his cheek. The boy's eyes bulged, and in that instant, his eyes reflected a snow-white figure. He blinked, and when he opened his eyes again, that reflection was gone. Seeing that Julien had actually showed himself for a second, Fengshen spoke up. "Your Highness, just now, did you—" Julien looked confused. "Just now? Oh, my power's failing. I slipped up for a moment, that's all." The boy straightened up and rubbed hard at his eyes, as if trying desperately to retain that ephemeral shadow. Julien, however, closed his own. Moments later, he spoke. "Forget it." He'd finally received a response. Yet those were the words. That boy's eyes first lit up, his lips curling into a smile, but soon his expression turned to shock, and the curve of his lips fell. "What? Forget what?" Julien breathed a sigh and said to him in a soft voice, "Forget me." The boy was stunned and silent. "Forget me. Soon no one will remember anyway," Julien mumbled to himself. Hearing this, the boy's eyes widened. Silently, a single line of tears rolled down and washed a trail of pale white on his grimy face. He swallowed hard and gasped, Fengshen seemed unable to bear the sight any longer and spoke up. "Your Highness, don't say any more. You're breaking the rules again." "Yes, I'm done. I've already broken so many rules. Just a few more words won't hurt, Julien said. He didn't let the boy hear that last part. The three descended from the altar and walked toward the entrance of the broken great hall. The night breeze cut through him, and Julien shook his head. He was still a heavenly official for now, and technically, he couldn't feel cold. Yet at that moment, he somehow felt a bone-deep chill. However, the boy they left behind in the great hall suddenly muttered, "I won't." He clearly couldn't see Julien and his companions, but he somehow accurately grasped the right direction and charged out of the temple toward them, shouting at their retreating backs, "I won't!" The three of them looked back and saw the boy's eyes, shining so bright in the black night that they pierced the soul. That battered face was both furious and sorrowful, both joyous and wild. In the midst of pouring tears, he cried, "I won't forget! I will never forget you!" And we have an illustration. And that is the end of Act 2.